If you can massage your numbers to attract better talent, then you're gaining a sporting advantage through financial misdemeanors. If that is the case, I think we would be looking at a points deduction somewhere in the region of 60 to 100 points.
Hello and welcome to Stretford Paddock. My name is Joe and I'm joined by football finance expert and friend of the channel at this point as well, Kieran Maguire. We've got loads to talk about, Kieran, but first of all, how are you doing?
I'm sound. It's been a busy day. Started at 6 o'clock this morning. I think I've done 16 or 17 interviews already. So it's nice to be with a friendly face at last.
Oh, thank you very much. Hopefully you won't have to do as many as 115 interviews, but we'll save that number for maybe later on in the conversation. But we're going to be talking about Manchester City, of course. This trial has begun and we're going to be getting into the likely ramifications. What do you think is going on there? And as well, Man United have released their yearly accounts for 23-24. So it's going to be worth looking at that, seeing how the sort of PSR figures stack up and where it leaves Manchester United basically as the new owners come in. And it feels like we've got a bit of momentum, maybe off the pitch more than on the pitch, but it seems like things might be moving in the right direction. But we'll get your thoughts on that. But let's start first of all on this Manchester City business. Firstly, before we get into the details, I've got loads of questions that are just sort of picking things apart and wanting you basically to say that they're absolutely screwed. Firstly, what do you think is likely here? Is it not just in terms of a punishment, but how long is this set to last? And what do you think we might well see sort of in the coming weeks?
I think in terms of the timescale, and you raise a good point there, Joe, there's 115 charges. In fact, there's 129 when you go through them on one-by-one basis. It's taken both Manchester City and the Premier League 18 months to put together both the prosecution and the defence. So therefore, the hearing, we estimate it's going to take somewhere in the region of 8 to 10 weeks to complete. Then there's three people on the commission who are listening to the evidence. They're going to go away. They're going to go away for 2 or 3 months, and they will scribble down things in their notebooks. There'll be things that they want to follow up on, and then they will together reach a verdict on each of those 115 charges. And the chances are we probably won't hear that verdict until February or March of 2025. And then the fun begins. Clearly, we'll be given a heads up in all probability that it's going to be announced at 10 o'clock. Everybody stand by your beds. Something will be published, and either City fans will be delighted or they'll be checking their sat navs for Coventry and Plymouth for next season. Or we could be somewhere in between, but I think the in between is probably less likely.
I'll get into some of the specifics of the punishments in a second, but just for people who don't know, including myself, what does this trial look like? Because when I think trial, I think either sort of curly wigs and gowns and gavels, or you think the American kind of O.J. Simpson holding up gloves and you've got a 12-person jury, you've got people taking the stand. You mentioned that there's a 3-person panel. What will this look like, and will it be public in any way, or is it purely a closed sort of independent trial?
Well, if I answer your final question first, it's a civic issue. It is a commission which has been agreed. If you sign up to be part of the Premier League, you have to agree to its rules and the way that commissions are conducted. So it's the equivalent of a civic trial. So there'll be no judges in gowns. It'll be suits rather than robes. Okay. Manchester City will have a team of defendants. The Premier League equally has a team of prosecutors. Interestingly, I don't know if you've been following the Twitter account of The Lawyer magazine this morning. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it, folks, but they've been very detailed in that. They know the names of the people, and there are people from the same chambers in terms of barristers working for both the prosecution and the defence. But the way to think of a King's Counsel is that they're effectively self-employed. They're effectively freelancers. So although they might occupy the same building, they're not actually colleagues in terms of working together on projects necessarily. So an awful lot of work has gone into generating the evidence. We saw in the case of Everton, I think there were 40,000 documents put together by both the prosecution and the defence. Now, that was for one case, and that was dealing with a relatively narrow period of time. The accusations against Manchester City apply over the course of a decade, so we could be looking at 500,000 pieces of paper, 500,000 pieces of evidence from both the Premier League side to support the prosecution and Manchester City's position to support the defence.
And just, I mean, there's so many questions I could ask about this. Obviously, the City have had the sort of the history of they lost one investigation and then it was overturned, and there was questions about sort of the timing of some of the evidence almost going out of date and there being a kind of an issue there. There was also some people suggesting that some of the evidence that would have really helped the prosecution was never actually brought forward because they sort of thought the case was, we'll win it, we'll be fine. Just quickly, there's no real sort of statute of limitations or equivalent for this stuff, is there? It's Premier League, it's internal. They can't go, oh, actually, we've waited too long, we can't look at that stuff from 2012 anymore. Is that correct?
I think in this particular case, and it has to be stressed, I'm not a lawyer, I'm just a teacher, but my understanding is that if the case relates to some form of accusation of corporate fraud, and that's what we're effectively looking at here. The accusation that the senior executives of Manchester City deliberately withheld information or renumbered figures or disguised who the money was coming from. So that is effectively a fraudulent activity. There is no statute of limitations, and therefore, regardless of the date of the evidence, and remember these charges cover the period 2009 to 2018, everything is admissible. Also, looking at the Premier League handbook, the source of the information is deemed to be admissible, given that part of Manchester City's position is this information was hacked emails, they've been taken out of context, they could still be used by the prosecution. Equally, City will attempt to contextualise them as part of their defence.
Wow, I wish we could see it. I wish it was televised. I'd be watching that 24/7 like when Big Brother used to be on. You can just tune in at any time. I've got a few more questions on this, sorry. So just in terms of the specifics of it, there's 115 charges. My understanding is a large sort of swath of those charges are basically City denying access or being a bit difficult basically to play with. Presumably being a bit difficult carries less harsh punishments than making up numbers or sponsoring yourself at inflated rates. How many of these charges, and which charges, you don't need to go into the numbering, but which charges are the ones where you need to watch out for them carrying the heaviest weight in terms of punishment? What are the big boy charges that could get City relegated? Because presumably not showing you their emails isn't going to get them sent down to League Two, is it?
That's right. I think we can actually narrow the charges down into three. First of all, the accusation that Manchester City received money from the owners and they disguised that as money from commercial sponsors. Now, if that is the case, that is, in theory, some form of fraudulent activity. I think that would be the most significant issue. There has to be a high burden of proof, though, because if for that to stick, you've got to find, first of all, the smoking gun coming from Manchester City. Secondly, there's got to be some form of agreement as far as the sponsors are concerned. And thirdly, you then have to ask yourself, well, why were the auditors asleep at the wheel? And why was the Premier League asleep at the wheel during this period of time? Surely there should have been some spidey senses that would have been triggered in terms of the extent of the numbers. So I think that's the most critical one. I agree with you that not cooperating with somebody who's accessed my emails through hacking, it isn't going to be a significant issue. That will just be that will be an addendum, and it's unlikely. And let's face it, if City are found innocent of the first two sets of charges, we saw with UEFA, who did give City a financial penalty of around about 9 to 10 million euros for not being particularly cooperative. If you offered that to the Etihad today, they'd snap your hand off. So I don't think that's going to be an issue. The other main area is that City were paying players and paying managers off the books. I think the one which has been quoted most of all is an accusation. You've got to stress these are accusations. We're not saying that these are the case. The accusation that Roberto Mancini was on about £2 million a year at the Etihad, and he was being paid another £2 million a year for doing 4 days worth of coaching in Abu Dhabi. Now, Joe, if Abu Dhabi offer you £2 million to do 4 days of podcasting, as much as you love the Paddock, the chances are you probably give it serious consideration, as would I. So we're not saying that there's anything wrong with that. And provided Mancini's declared it to the tax authorities, the person involved in the clear. But if it can be proven that this was a deliberate attempt to artificially hide costs of the club, then that could be a significant issue as well.
Yeah, that's the thing, isn't it? I mean, something else that gets mentioned a lot is the punishment and the points deductions of Everton and Forest. And these seem to be, like you said, a lot more straightforward, less details, less data. I think Everton did get punished for not cooperating, but compared to what we're seeing from Man City, they did seem to cooperate. Certainly that stuff got done a lot quicker. Just how different is it? I mean, I guess it amounts to the same thing, but in terms of what you see as a likely punishment, Everton, for example, let's say they spent more than they earned and they sort of declared those losses and they went, you've lost too much money there, here's a points deduction. Man City haven't spent more than they've earned, but they've pretended that the earnings have come from somewhere that they haven't. Let's say that is proven or something to that effect. Are they one and the same? Do you think the punishments will be the same? Or will they be punished differently, even though they kind of amount to the same thing, but through different means?
I think they are chalk and cheese. They are light years apart.
Okay.
If you take a look at Everton, I think you can say Everton was more due to incompetence than anything else. They budgeted to finish 8th in the Premier League and they finished 16th or 17th. Well, that probably it cost you £3.5 million per place. They bought a load of crap. Yeah, they spent big money with big wages on players who didn't deliver. Now, as a United fan, you've probably got a bit of sympathy for them there because you can go down a list of the Di Marias of this world and Donny van der Beeks and so on. So that wasn't done with bad intentions. You hoped the players were going to deliver. You hoped the players were going to enhance the club on the pitch, and they failed to do so. The accusations against Manchester City is that the club went out deliberately to mislead the Premier League, to misrepresent its financial position to the Premier League. One of the interesting things, well, for me at least, when I read the Commission reports in relation to Nottingham Forest points deduction, they said, ultimately, this is what we consider to be a minor breach of the Premier League rulebook. Forest came in, they spent big because they wanted to stay in the Premier League. They didn't manage it in terms of bringing enough money or spending too much. It was, if you look at the number of players that Forest signed, they had a few turkeys and things didn't work out. There was no malice involved, whereas I think the accusations against Manchester City are different. Talking to various people in the legal world, their view that Manchester City would therefore be deemed to be a major breach of the rules. It covers a period of 9 years, and therefore, if proven, Manchester City were given an unfair advantage over the rest of the Premier League. Because let's be honest, football's a talent game, and talent follows the money. If you can massage your numbers to attract better talent, then you're gaining a sporting advantage through financial misdemeanors. If that is the case, I think we would be looking at a points deduction somewhere in the region of 60 to 100 points. And the reason why I say that is that you have to do two things when you make a judgment. If somebody's been involved in quasi-fraud or fraudulent activities, you've got A, to be seen to be punishing them, and B, you've got to be seen to be creating a precedent that would make anybody who's thinking of repeating such an approach, that would act as a huge barrier. So you've got to have a barrier to future misbehaviour. If you give that points deduction to City, let's face it, if they get a 60 points deduction, they could still stay up. If they get a 100 points deduction, they're down. And then they would have to start the following season in the EFL. Remember, these charges are from the Premier League. It's nothing to do with the EFL. So under the statute, as far as I can make out, the EFL would have to accept them in the EFL Championship. You can't do the equivalent of what we saw with Rangers just over a decade ago, where you have one body covering all of professional football in Scotland, and therefore you can demote them 3 divisions.
Wow. I mean, the 100-point deduction would be quite funny in the sense that they have to play out a sort of basically useless season in the Premier League knowing they're going to get relegated anyway. That would be quite lovely. In terms of just a relegation, and so like you said, they can only really be relegated once because this is only a sort of a Premier League issue. You said before about there's two options here, or as you see it, two more likely options. One is a sort of, they get away with it, in quotes, or the other one is a relegation or a huge points deduction, like you said. Do you think it is that sort of that severe then, that it's going to be either actually they didn't do much wrong and maybe they covered stuff up a bit, here's a few million quid fine, or bang, you're getting relegated? Do you think it will be that sort of heavy-handed by the Premier League?
Well, remember, it's not the Premier League. It is an independent commission. It's the Premier League which has brought the charges, and we have to state that, because whilst I'm not the biggest fan of the Premier League, they're just trying to apply the rules. The rules are ultimately agreed by the clubs. It's difficult to see a situation in which the club disguised income from a party one year and then treated it correctly the following year. That would seem to be very strange. So I think there would be a domino effect. It could be that all of the accusations in respect to inflating income are proven, but all of the accusations with regards to disguising wages are not proven. So I think it will be that type of thing. You could have this set of charges, which all relate to broadly the same issue. Yes, guilty. The others not guilty, and so on. And then you've got to say, well, let's work out the value of all of those things put together, because it's a lot of money, but 2 million quid to Mancini is peanuts in the wider scheme of things. And if that's the only thing that sticks, then they're just going to get a fiscal penalty. And you and I, we both been around football. We know other clubs in other divisions where players are getting paid for perhaps working for the owner's company on a part-time basis, and so on. I know loads and loads of things which take place which really aren't part of the rules, but they're not actually a heinous offence. So we have to wait for the reaction and the verdict before we can determine whether, in the court of opinion of our head, whether the punishment is appropriate.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, the punishment has to be almost sort of more severe than the gain that was given to City by breaking those rules if they did, because otherwise everyone would choose to break the rules, because the punishment ain't as bad as what you can achieve by breaking them. They have to prove, it has to be worse for them to have done it than not to have done it, if you get my point. Let's just move on a little bit to Manchester United then. And United have released their accounts for the 23-24 season. Just one thing that immediately popped out was United have lost money basically for the last 5 years. Is that an issue that we need to be worried about? Is that something that United could face punishment for? Because, losing money every year doesn't seem like a way to sort of stay in PSR's favour.
Yeah, it's a funny one, because PSR is assessed over a 3-year period and you're only allowed to lose £105 million. At first glance, you see that Manchester United lost £313 million over 3 years, and you're going, blimey, that seems a bit strange. But you are allowed to make adjustments. If you spent money on infrastructure, now, okay, we know it's the Glazers, so there's not been a lot. If you spent money on the academy, and Manchester United have a big academy, it's an expensive academy, so we're probably talking 20-25 million a season. There potentially. If you've got a women's team, if you've got a community scheme, and again, let's be perfectly honest, we're not big fans of the Glazers, but the community scheme at Manchester United is pretty damn good. So money does go into that. But also, there's a couple of other issues. First of all, we're looking at the seasons 21-22, 22-23, and 23-24. And in 21-22, that started on the 1st of July 2021. Now, according to the club, it had a detrimental impact on the club in terms of COVID to the tune of £40 million. Manchester United couldn't go to China on a pre-season tour. It's got mega stores in Asia, which it couldn't open, so that impacted upon revenues and so on. And quite a bit of fuss has been made about this. my understanding from discussions with what I can only describe as senior sources in football seem to think that Manchester United are in the clear on that. They put in these claims and they were accepted by the Premier League, and there's nothing to do with it. I think of slightly more intrigue is that when the Glazers decided to sell a proportion of the club to Jim Ratcliffe last year, they incurred very significant legal costs and advisory costs, which seemed pretty harsh, I think, through the eyes of many Manchester United fans, because the biggest beneficiaries of this were the Glazer family itself. And why should therefore the club put through these costs? Those costs were probably in the region of 30 to 40 million pounds as well. And if that is the case, do they count towards PSR or don't they? My understanding is the club is remaining very tight-lipped on this, as is the Premier League. It doesn't appear on the face of it to be an allowable expense, but we don't know whether a conversation was started before Manchester United worked out their 23-24 figures or not. So United do not have a lot of wiggle room. So remember, they have spent big since the 1st of July, because that effectively resets the clock. But they don't have a huge room to manoeuvre. So yeah, the sale of Greenwood, the sale of McTominay and so on have been really beneficial to Manchester United since the 1st of July, because that counts as pure profit from a PSR position for the 3 years ended the 30th of June 2025.
Wow. So it sounds like we're really sort of riding that line of, yeah, we can just about make that, and if you get that back there, it's like when you sort of at the end of the month trying to get all your bills together, and if I swap that over there and put that credit card on that one, like we're really kind of doing everything we can to sneak through here, aren't we? Just for any sort of confusion, does this period cover the time post Jim Ratcliffe's takeover or Ineos's takeover? Because there's talks of this injection of money, somewhere between 2 and 300 million. Will that count anyway towards PSR, or is that investment in infrastructure and other things that won't be included? And does this go basically right up to, July that's just gone? Is this everything right up to date?
Yeah, it's up to the 30th of June. 2024. So it does include, I think it's about 130 million pounds worth of cash injection from the share issue. That's been partly used to pay down the debt a little bit, but Manchester United's debts are still pretty high, and I'm not opposed to debt if it's used for the right thing. So if you take a look at Spurs have borrowed a lot of money, but I don't know whether you've been to their stadium, Joe. It is fantastic. It is 21st century stadium. It's absolutely brilliant, and they've just signed a deal with the local council to have 30 non-football events take place at White Hart Lane a year.
Wow.
So yeah, Taylor Swift, Beyonce, Foo Fighters, whoever it's going to be. So they're going to benefit financially in terms of the impact of their match day revenues. They have trebled. So if you borrow money for the right things, I think the accusation which is made against the Glazer family was that they borrowed money, or rather they got the club to borrow money, which the Glazers then used to pay for Manchester United. And that's always, I think, stuck in the throat of many Manchester United fans. If we take a look at the total interest paid, that's the net interest paid since the Glazers acquired Manchester United, it's £961 million. So I'd expect that figure to potentially go through the £1 billion barrier, perhaps by the end of calendar year 2024. And that's money which could have been used for other things. And I think that's caused an awful lot of angst and resentment towards the Glazers. There doesn't appear to have ever been a desire to pay down the debt. Yes, they've renegotiated it on occasions to reduce the interest rate, but you're still paying out an awful lot of interest. That could be going spent on OT itself. It could be spent on Carrington. It could be spent on improving the squad. It could be spent on improving the facilities and the infrastructure around the ground. None of that has taken place.
It's incredible, isn't it? We're getting to the point where that money that they've just taken or spent on interest could literally have bought this new stadium that we're talking about. Like, we're almost in that ballpark of there's your new stadium, not for free, but using money that United have earned themselves and had to give away because the Glazers bought the club in a way that is now deemed against the rules. I mean, it's just, as I'm sure you're aware, so frustrating for every single Manchester United fan. But thank you very much, Kieran, for coming on. Honestly, breaking that down, it's got me a little bit excited, actually, this whole... When you said between 60 and 100 points, that got me so riled up, I can't wait for the end of this. I mean, it's probably just going to be a slap on the wrist and we'll move on. But the idea of City starting next season with a 100-point deduction is absolutely brilliant. So even if this is the best it gets, thank you very much, Kieran. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks as always for the invite, and keep up the great work on the Paddock.
Thank you very much. Right, thank you everyone for joining at home. Thank you again. Hit subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and we'll see you in a bit.